In the autumn of 1881, on a stretch of Dakota territory where the wind never once stopped to catch its breath, a woman planted 300 feet of saplings in a straight line across open prairie, and everyone who saw it thought grief had finally taken her mind. She was 31 years old. She had 2 children, one root cellar half-stocked for winter, and a deed that no longer had her name on it. And in less than 4 months, the temperature on that flat would fall to 39 degrees below zero. Men who had built their whole lives out of timber and stone would lose everything in a single night. She would lose nothing. Before the story ends, you will understand exactly why a widow with a shovel out built every carpenter in the county, and why, when the storm finally came, it was her door they knocked on. Stay until the end, because the coldest night in that valley's history is also the night this story earns its name. If you believe the land always favors the strong, subscribe now, and let's find out together whether you're wrong. Her name was Ada Calloway, and until that September, she had lived on 80 acres that her husband Thomas had broken with his own hands, turned sod, dug a well, raised a cabin with a good stone chimney. Thomas died in July, thrown from a wagon on the Bismarck Road, and within 6 weeks, his brother Whit arrived from Ohio with a lawyer and a piece of paper. The claim, it turned out, had never been properly filed in Ada's name, only Thomas's, and Thomas had a brother who was, by law, next of kin before a wife who couldn't prove otherwise. Whit did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood in the doorway of the cabin Ada had scrubbed and mended for 6 years, and told her she had until the first frost to be gone. She left with her son Eli, 10 years old, her daughter Nell, 7, a wagon of what could be carried, a dog named Rook, and $40 Thomas had kept sewn into a coat lining for an emergency neither of them had imagined would be this one. The only land left to buy for that money was a flat, treeless stretch 2 miles north that everyone in the valley called the Flats, not out of affection, but because nothing grew there taller than buffalo grass. The wind came down off the ridge with nothing to slow it, gathered speed across 4 unbroken miles of open ground, and hit whatever stood on the flats like it had a grudge against it personally. Nobody had built there in 9 years. The last man who tried lost his roof twice in one winter and moved to town before Christmas. So when Ada Calloway showed up in late September with a wagon of bare root saplings, cottonwood, box elder, and willow, bought cheap from a nurseryman passing through with a load nobody else wanted, the valley decided, almost as one, that the widow had lost her sense along with her land. Sensible people on the flats built a stove first, or a good tight roof, or at the very least a windbreak of hauled lumber that would stand the day it went up. Ada did none of that. She did not build first. She did not fence first. She planted first. 300 feet of green, scrawny sticks, no thicker than a broom handle, staggered across the northwest edge of her new claim, facing straight into the wind that had run every other soul off that ground in 9 years. Otis Pruitt, who ran the feed store and considered himself the wit of the township, was the one who gave it its name. He stood at the edge of the road one afternoon, watched her drive a 3rd row of saplings into ground, so thin you could see rock 2 inches down, and said to anyone within earshot that the widow was building herself a hedge to keep out a Dakota winter, as if sticks and string could do what timber and stone hadn't managed on that ground in years. The widow's hedge, he called it, and the name stuck before the first snow ever fell, repeated at the feed store counter and over the fence rails until half the township had heard it and laughed along without ever once walking out to see the rows for themselves. Hiram Cobb, who ran cattle on the good land east of town, rode past one morning and laughed loud enough that Ada heard it from her own field, then said, loud enough to carry, that she'd have better luck praying for a mild winter than counting on twigs to stop one. Ada straightened, looked at him once, and went back to the spade without a word. Silence on the flats that fall was the only answer she gave anyone, and it unsettled the mockers far more than an argument ever would have. She had learned to give that kind of answer a long time before Dakota. Ada's grandfather, Ezra Voss, had kept an orchard in eastern Ohio for 40 years, on a hillside that took the worst of every lake effect storm that rolled down from the north. He had planted 3 long rows of hardy trees on the exposed side of that orchard before Ada was even born. And as a girl, she used to ask him why he wasted good ground on trees that didn't bear fruit, when the whole point of an orchard was the fruit itself. He would set down his spade, wipe his hands on his trousers, and tell her the same thing every time, in the same unhurried voice, as though the answer never tired him, no matter how many times a child asked it. A tree bends so the house won't have to. Wood that gives a little, he told her, breaks the worst of the wind before it ever reaches the wall, takes the blow, absorbs it, lets go of it, and stands back up to take the next one. A wall that refuses to give, he said, eventually doesn't stand at all. It only waits for the gusts strong enough to prove it. Ezra Voss died the winter Ada turned 16, in the same bed he'd slept in for 30 years, in a house that had never once lost a roof to weather in all that time. She had carried the sound of that voice across 4 states and 11 years of marriage, without ever having a real use for it, until a lawyer with Whit Calloway's signature on his paperwork put her out on the one piece of ground in the county too, exposed for anyone else to want. The one man in the valley whose opinion still carried weight even against a widow's desperation was Silas Merritt, who had built half the sound structures standing in that township and lost none of them to weather in 18 years of trying. Silas rode out to the flats in early October, looked over Ada's 3 staggered rows of young trees, and did not laugh. He respected work too much to laugh at it, even work he believed was wasted. Instead, he dismounted, walked the length of her planting once in silence, and told her, plainly and without malice, that green wood that thin would snap in a hard wind before it ever grew thick enough to matter, that root systems needed 3, 4, 5 years to anchor properly in soil that shallow, and that she did not have 5 years. She had 1 winter, 2 children, and a root cellar that wasn't half full. He told her a windbreak of saplings was a plan for 1886, not for the winter bearing down on her now, and that what she needed instead was sod walls banked high on the north face, and a stove that could hold heat through a Dakota night on its own, not a hedge that wouldn't earn its keep for half a decade. He'd seen young orchards flattened by lesser storms than what this country could produce, he told her, and he'd rather see her spend what little money and daylight she had left on something that would keep her children warm this January, not 5 Januaries from now. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic, delivered by a man who had buried enough neighbors under collapsed roofs and torn off shingles to know exactly what the numbers demanded of a person with no margin left to spend. Ada listened to every word of it, thanked him for the trouble of riding out, and did not argue a single point. Then, once his horse had carried him back down the road toward town, she went back to planting. What Silas Merritt did not know, what nobody on the flats knew yet, was that Ada was not building for 5 years from now. She was building the way her grandfather had built, not one wall of trees, but three, offset from each other like a woven fence, close enough together that even a young, thin trunk could lean on its neighbor and share the load of the wind instead of standing alone against the whole of it. Through October, she worked from first light until she couldn't see her own hands, staking each sapling with a length of green willow so it could bend without uprooting, packing the base of each one with a mix of manure and prairie sod to hold moisture the thin ground wouldn't give up on its own. She measured the spacing at 4 feet between trees within a row, 6 feet between the 3 rows themselves, so that wind funneling through the first line would already be broken and slowed before it ever reached the second, and broken again, smaller, tamer, no longer a battering ram, before it touched the third. 300 feet of that, running the full northwest face of her claim, was the only thing standing between her cabin and every mile of open Dakota beyond it. By the first week of September, before a single tree went into the ground, Ada walked the whole northwest edge of her claim with a length of knotted twine, marking the line the wind favored most, the low, funnel draw, where every gust of the ridge gathered speed before it crossed her ground. That was where the first row would go. Not because it was the easiest ground to break, but because it was the ground the wind would hit first. By the middle of September, the wagon loads began arriving from the nurseryman's cart. 240 cottonwood whips no thicker than a finger, 60 box elder, and a bundle of willow switches meant only for staking, not for planting at all. She sorted them by size on the cabin floor the first night, the smallest saplings set aside for the inner rows where they'd be sheltered by their taller neighbors, the sturdiest reserved for the row that would take the wind's first blow. Through the last weeks of September, Ada broke ground with a spade too heavy for her own frame, digging each hole 18 inches down through sod that hadn't been turned in 9 years, deep enough, her grandfather had always told her, that a young root could find something to hold on to. Besides hope, she packed the base of each planting with a mix of composted manure hauled from the old claim's abandoned corral and prairie sod turned upside down to smother the grass roots that would otherwise choke a sapling before it ever took hold. By August, she had thought she'd have 3 full rows in by the first hard frost. By mid-October, working from first light until she couldn't see her own hands in front of her, she had barely finished 2. Eli helped haul water in a barrel dragged behind the wagon 2 trips a day because the ground was too dry that fall to trust to rain alone, and by October, the barrel run had worn a visible track between the well and the planting line. Nell's job was smaller, but no less serious to her. She walked the rows each evening with a tin cup, giving each sapling what her mother called its supper, and naming the ones she liked best, so that by November, there was a cottonwood called Buttons and a box elder called the General standing in the second row. Rook, the dog, a rangy brindle mutt with a bark bigger than his body, patrolled the length of the planting like he understood it was his to guard, though what he was really guarding that first month was nothing but string, stakes, and hope. Ada measured every gap by pacing it herself rather than trusting a rope that might stretch or shrink in the damp. 4 feet between trees within a row, 6 feet between the 3 rows, so that the wind funneling through the first line would already be broken and slowed before it ever reached the second, and broken again, smaller, tamer, no longer a battering ram, before it touched the third. Each sapling got a willow stake driven at an angle, not straight up, so the young trunk could lean and bend against it rather than snap where it met the ground. Her palm split and bled from the stake work before the second week was out. She wrapped them in strips of an old shirt each night and was back at the spade by sunrise. She told her children, when Nell asked if the trees would really stop winter, that a tree does not stop anything by itself. It only slows the wind down enough that a house has a fighting chance. The real secret, though she never spoke the word aloud to anyone in the valley, was still there. Moving wind steals warmth from a wall faster than any cold ever could, on its own. Break the wind, and even thin walls hold their heat. Her grandfather had never used those words for it. He had only ever said, "A tree bends, so the house won't have to." The first real test came in the last week of October, and it came before the trees were ready for any test at all. A hard front blew through overnight. Not a blizzard, just an ordinary autumn gale, the kind the valley saw 2 or 3 times a season. But it came from due northwest, straight down the line Ada had planted, and by morning the outer row was in ruins. 9 of the youngest cottonwoods lay flat, roots half torn from ground that hadn't had time to grip them. Willow stakes snapped at the base where she'd driven them too shallow to hold against a real gust. Ada walked the row at dawn in silence, Rook at her heel, and for one long moment stood over the wreckage without moving at all. Otis Pruitt, riding past on the road that morning, saw it too, and did not bother hiding his satisfaction. But Ada did not see failure the way Otis did. She knelt down in the wreckage of the outer row and studied the roots of the fallen trees the way her grandfather had taught her to study anything that broke. Not with despair, but with a question. Every tree that had fallen, she noticed, stood alone at the outer edge, with no neighbor close enough to share the load. Every tree that survived stood shoulder to shoulder with 2 or 3 others, roots close enough underground to hold each other's ground even when the stakes above failed. She pulled one snapped trunk fully out of the dirt and turned it over in her hands, and found the break wasn't in the wood at all. It was at the stake, where she'd driven the willow support straight down instead of at an angle, so that the young tree had nowhere to give when the gust hit it, and simply broke instead of bending. The problem wasn't the wind. The problem was spacing and depth, and the mistaken idea that a windbreak's first row should be its strongest, when in truth, the first row's whole purpose was to sacrifice itself for the second. She spent 3 full days tearing out the failed outer line and replanting it closer, 2 feet nearer its neighbors than before, staked twice as deep and driven at a lean into the prevailing wind rather than straight and rigid against it, bending the way her grandfather had always said a tree ought to bend so that something else wouldn't have to. She reset 31 stakes in all, not just the 9 that had failed, because she no longer trusted any of the ones she'd driven the old way. Eli dug while she staked. Nell walked behind them both, pressing loose sod back around each base with her boot heel the way her mother showed her. When she finished, the line was shorter in places, but far denser, thick enough in its first 50 feet that a man could no longer walk a straight path through it without turning sideways. She had lost 9 saplings and 4 days of a season she couldn't spare. She had also, though she didn't yet have proof of it, built something considerably stronger than what she'd started with. A wall that gave a little, everywhere, instead of standing stiff in a few places and failing there first. By November, the geese that usually held the sky over the flats late into the month were gone before the 15th, gone early, all at once. In formation so long, Nell counted past 100 before she lost her place and gave up counting. The cattle on Hiram Cobb's range bunched tight against the leeward side of his barn 3 full days before anyone thought to move them there on purpose, as if the herd itself had read something in the air that the men hadn't. Rook stopped sleeping curled by the children's bed and began sleeping instead against the cabin's northwest wall, the wall that backed on to the young Windbreak, pressed so close to the sod that Ada had to step over him to reach the door each morning. She noticed, without yet knowing what to make of it, that the dog had chosen the one wall in the cabin that the tree stood behind, as though he trusted the line she'd planted more than he trusted the open dark beyond it. An old Norwegian settler 2 miles east, a man named Halvard, who had outlived 3 winters everyone else in the valley still called the worst in memory, rode past the flats in the last week of November and stopped only long enough to say that the birds were wrong for the season, that the light on the ridge had gone the wrong color for November, and that the air smelled the way it had smelled before the winter that took his brother 30 years earlier. Nobody in the valley put a number on what was coming. Nobody could have. They only felt the wind die, not fall, not ease, but stop, all at once, the way a held breath finally lets go right before the scream. It died on the 2nd of December, all at once, the way a held breath finally lets go. For 3 days, the valley sat under a sky the color of unwashed wool, and the wind that had not stopped moving across those flats in 9 years, simply stopped. Not calm, not peaceful. Dead still, the way a room goes dead still after a shot is fired and before anyone screams. Ada stood in her doorway on the evening of the 4th and watched Rook stare northwest into nothing, hackles raised, refusing every call to come inside. And she understood, before any thermometer told her anything, that the valley's real winter had finally arrived. They would call it the hard white before the season was out. And the name fitted the way a shroud fits. It came down off the northern plains on the night of December 5th, with no warning beyond that stillness. A wall of snow and wind that erased the horizon in the space of 20 minutes and did not let up for 2 full days. The temperature, when the town clerk finally got a thermometer read through the whiteout on the morning of the 6th, stood at 39 degrees below zero, with a wind that made the true cold feel closer to 60 below on any exposed skin. Nature had arrived on the flats the way it arrived everywhere in that country, without malice, without mercy, and without the smallest interest in who deserved what. It did not know that Ada Calloway had 2 children, and a dog, and a hedge of half-grown trees. It only asked, of every structure standing in its path, the one question it ever asked: can the wind get in? Cabins with sound walls and thin foundations found out that answer within hours. Barns with proud, wide doors found out sooner. The storm judged everything the same way, by results, and it did not care in the slightest what anyone had believed about the widow on the flats back in October. Inside Ada's cabin, that first night, the stove held its heat far longer than it should have on the wood she'd fed it, and she noticed it even through her worry for the line outside. The flame burned steadier, the draw through the chimney quieter, as if the wind simply wasn't reaching the walls the way it reached every other structure on the flats. She did not let herself trust it yet. She had learned, by then, not to trust anything about that winter until it had proven itself twice. The second night was the worst of it. Deep into the dark, with the wind screaming loud enough that Eli had to shout to be heard across the cabin, Ada heard something over even that roar. A low groaning crack from outside. Wood, under a strain it wasn't built to survive. She lit the lantern, wrapped every scrap of wool she owned around her face and hands, and went out into a whiteout so total she could not see her own porch post from 3 feet away. Snow had drifted hard against the windward face of the young trees, and the weight of it, feet of it, packed and frozen, was bending the middle row nearly flat against the ground, threatening to tear the whole planting open at its center and hand the wind a clean gap straight through to the cabin wall. If that gap opened, she understood in an instant, every foot of ground she'd broken since September would count for nothing. She worked by feel more than sight, driving fresh stakes into drifted snow with a mallet her hands could barely close around, packing the loosened base of each leaning trunk, cutting the worst of the ice-crusted snow load away from the branches with a hatchet so the trees could straighten under their own strength instead of snapping under a weight no sapling was built to carry. The wind took her breath twice and put her flat on one knee once, and both times she got back up without setting down the hatchet. Eli came out against her orders, found her by the sound of the blade striking ice-crusted wood, and together, wordless, they held the lantern low and packed snow at the base of the worst leaning trees until the middle row finally held its ground again. It was, Ada would say, only once, years later, and only to her daughter, the longest hour of her life. The wind did not get through. The gap never opened. By the time she came back inside, her hands too numb to feel the door latch. The cabin behind that line of bent, straining, unbroken trees was still holding at a temperature the storm outside should never have allowed. The hard white broke on the morning of the 8th, and what it left behind told its own story. Before anyone said a word, 3 cabins on the open range east of town had lost their roofs outright to snow load with no break in the wind to lighten it. Silas Merritt's own barn, built as solid as any structure in the township, had a wall stove in on its northwest face where the wind had struck it directly for 2 straight days without ever once being slowed. 2 families on the far side of the ridge had burned through nearly their entire winter's cord of wood in just 4 days, feeding stoves that could not hold heat against wind that never stopped finding its way through every seam in the timber. The town clerk, going door to door once the roads were passable, carried 2 thermometers with him that week, one to record the outside temperature at each stop, one for indoors, and the ledger he kept became, without anyone intending it, the argument's final word. Outside, across the valley, the reading held steady near 40 below at every stop he made. Inside cabins with no break in the wind at all, families had huddled through the worst of it at temperatures barely above freezing, blankets nailed over windows, children sleeping in their coats. Inside Ada Calloway's cabin, behind 300 feet of bent, battered, still-standing trees, the clerk's thermometer read 51 degrees, high enough that Nell had slept without her coat on both nights of the storm, and Rook had left the northwest wall for the first time in a week to stretch out by the stove instead. Silas Merritt read that number off the ledger himself, standing in Ada's doorway with his hat in his hands, and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he walked to the stove, pressed his bare palm flat against the sod wall beside it, felt the warmth still held there after 2 days and nights of the worst cold the valley had ever recorded, and said only, "I was wrong." He did not explain himself further. On the flats that winter, 2 words carried more weight than any speech could have. The knock on the door came 3 nights later, well after dark, when Ada had already banked the fire low for the night. It was Otis Pruitt, standing there first, heart already off before she'd fully opened the door. And behind him, Hiram Cobb's wife, with 2 children wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Both households burned out of firewood and burned out of shelter after the storm had torn the roofs from their outbuildings and left their main cabins barely holding heat at all. Otis did not manage the joke he might have made 2 months earlier. He stood in the cold with snow still crusted on his collar and simply asked, quietly, if there was room. Ada did not remind him of the name he'd given her hedge back in October. She did not ask him to say he'd been wrong, though every line of him already had. She only stepped back from the door, said there was room enough, and put 4 more places at a table that had never been generous, but had somehow, that winter, become the warmest one for 2 miles in any direction. The valley did its own gloating that spring, quietly, in the way small towns always do. But Ada Calloway never said a single word about it herself, then or ever after. By the following spring, the story of the flats had traveled the length of the valley and past it, and so had the trees. Neighbors who had once stood at the roadside laughing began driving their own wagon loads of cottonwood and willow out to their exposed fields, staggering 3 rows the way Ada had, staking them deep and letting them lean into the wind instead of standing stiff against it. Hiram Cobb planted a full 1/4 mile of it along his own north range before the next frost and told his sons it was the one piece of advice from a neighbor he'd ever taken, without arguing first. Silas Merritt himself planted a windbreak along the north face of his rebuilt barn that following autumn and told anyone who asked exactly where he'd learned the method, without a trace of the pride that might once have kept him from saying her name. Within a few years, the technique had a new name across that stretch of Dakota territory. Nobody called it the widow's hedge anymore. They called it the Calloway line, and the men who once needed convincing became the men who taught it to their own sons, walking them along the staggered rows and repeating, almost word for word, the same thing Ada had once told her daughter about a tree not stopping the wind so much as slowing it down enough to give a house a fighting chance. The trees Ada Calloway planted with bleeding hands in the fall of 1881 grew taller than the cabin they protected, thick enough within a decade that a man on horseback had to ride around the northwest edge of her claim rather than through it. Long after the story of the storm itself had faded into just another hard winter among many, the line of trees kept standing, kept bending, kept doing exactly what her grandfather had always said a tree was for. The strongest wall in that whole valley, it turned out, was never the one that refused to move. It was the one built to bend, so that everything behind it never had to. Would you have laughed at the widow planting sticks into frozen ground with winter bearing down? Or would you have been one of the few willing to listen to what she already knew about how a thing survives a storm it cannot stop?